started. A very warm welcome to this Founding Fuel Masterclass on geopolitics and global trade, how it impacts India. I think we're perfectly placed to tune into this conversation. We started, I think, planning more than a month ago, and we were very fortunate to have really a stellar panel this evening. And they've invested considerable amounts of time with us in individual briefing calls. We've become more familiar with their work, and they're joining us from different parts of the world. And I'll quickly introduce them in a bit. But before that, those conversations that Vivek and I had with our panelists also helped put together, I think, 3 crisply done briefings that help you get the inside track on some of their work, as well as the key issues that we're going to kind of discuss in today's masterclass. So, and we've got a fantastic audience as well. It's a by invitation masterclass. We've invited leaders from business, from academia, from policy, as well as media. So, and we've kind of designed this conversation to be interactive. So there will be occasion to open it up for questions and discussions, because we've come, and then of course, this is something that I know is of deep interest to folks in business, particularly because there's so much change playing out across the world. I needn't kind of talk about that. Vivek will set the context in a bit. But first, let me kind of quickly introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. Deborah Elms, who heads trade policy at the Heinrich Foundation, based in Singapore. Welcome, Deborah. I'm going to skip detailed introductions. You'll find in the chat links to their detailed profiles. In any case, if you had time to go through Vivek's briefings, you would be somewhat familiar with their work as well. Fantastic perspective each of them bring to the table. I'll come to you, Evan, Dr. Evan Feigenbaum, who's joining us today from New York. And great to have you, Evan. Evan, of course, is the Vice President for Studies at Carnegie Endowment, and he's had some very interesting connections with India as well over the years, including a stint as a columnist with Business Standard, the paper Vivek and I worked with, and several other interactions which he'll refer to in his conversation, I'm sure. Welcome on board, Ivan. Rick Rosso, again, is not unfamiliar name to most audiences in India. He's probably crisscrosses the country every month. Rick, would that be fair to say? And he's probably more familiar. Yes, so he travels quite widely, and he's of course anchored his perch is in Washington, D.C. as part of the chair of U.S. studies in India at CSIS. So we'll love to have you. Great to have you on board, Rick. Lovely to see you. And finally, Amitendu, who's kind of spent both time in the government in Delhi, working closely with them, and now a senior research fellow at NUS. So welcome on board, Amitendu. We're kind of delighted to have you. Before I hand it over to Vivek, Vivek, of course, again, is a familiar face for the Founding Fuel community. He's a columnist, researcher, analyst, and also was my first boss many years ago. So delighted to have you, Vivek. We know you're in good hands. We're in good hands. So over to you, and you can take it from there, and I'll be around. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Indrajit. And, I must thank this amazing panel for joining us today. It's great to have you guys here. Over the last week, we've had these briefings, which we've to use to set the context for the masterclass today. And the context, in short, is the US-China rivalry and how it's actually impacting the geopolitics of investment and trade. So we'll sort of divide this conversation into three parts. First, we'll look at the dynamics within the US, which is extremely important. Then we'll get down to the competitive stakes in the context of the US-China rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. We'll briefly refer to perhaps the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And in the third section, we'll try and take a dive into India and understand where India stands amidst the rivalry. So let's get started. Let's start with Evan and Deborah, and they both look at China and they're both extremely familiar with the US. So Evan and Deborah, let's start with some of the debates that are happening within the US. These days, they're all about national economic security, maintaining its global hegemony, especially in technology and the economy. There's so many recent committees there that look at China within the Senate and the Congress. China is the big question today. So what's emerging from these debates within the US on the China rivalry? Especially across the Senate and the Congress. And when one looks at questions like technology, trade, and investment, is there any point of consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats? Are there any differences? So either of you could start off. I mean, the floor is yours.
Deborah, you want to start?
Or you want me to? We're going to talk. You start, especially on Congress today.
All right, I'll start. First, it's good to be with you, and I appreciate the chance to do this, and good to do it with some old colleagues. I think I'd start this way. I've been involved with U.S.-China relations for, 30 years in and out of government. And I would say that in the last 7 or so, there's been really a wholesale change relative to the atmosphere, environment, and priorities that prevailed when I got started and came up in the field. And to answer your very direct question very directly, the way I describe it is that nearly everything, but particularly economic flows, have been securitized in ways that were not the case when I got started in this business. And when I say flows, what I mean is flows of goods, capital, people, data, and especially technology, which now are really being refracted across Washington by the political class, the strategic class, the regulatory class, through the prism of national security rather than just commercial benefit or public good. And that's very different because than it's been for most of my career. Because if you ask most people what they think has changed in the US-China relationship over the last few years, a lot of Washington people would say, well, there's more strategic competition than there was a decade or two ago. But strategic competition around security issues, it really isn't new. Issues like Taiwan, the South China Sea, military competition, these issues have always been with us. And in fact, if you rewind to the inception of the relationship when Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, the United States and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, and China was just crawling out of the Cultural Revolution. So from the very inception, you've had clashing security concepts and obvious differences of political system and ideology. So what's changed is that the economic relationship, which proceeded largely on a parallel track, has collapsed together with security and increasingly is being refracted through that prism. I worked 7 years for Hank Paulson. He ran Goldman Sachs before he was Treasury Secretary. He wasn't stupid. I mean, he knew that there were issues like Taiwan, like the South China Sea, but those security issues, and this is the point I'm trying to make to you, they never really impinged on business models. And if you were in the markets, whatever the asset classes you were trading, it didn't really impinge on the trade. So that's changed, and technology is especially vulnerable to that because so many of the emerging and foundational technologies, things like AI-enabled applications, quantum computing, new synthetic and composite materials, biotech and the life sciences, all of these things are intrinsically dual use. And so the impulse on the American side has been to control the flow of both technology and knowledge to China, and then to flip to the Chinese side to try to indigenize these things. And so at the intersection of the American impulse to control and the Chinese impulse to indigenize is this push and pull that you're now seeing, in which security and strategic competition are bleeding into markets, business strategies, and business models that really were not the case when I got started in the field. We can talk about, whether or not there's a partisan element of that, but I'd say at the macro level, that's really been a big change. And to be blunt about it, it's pretty bipartisan.
Well, that's just depressing. It's not a surprise, but it's just depressing, right? I mean, one of the things that I've been asking, I sit in Singapore, I go back to the US regularly. One of the things that I've been asking regularly is there any policy or proposal that would be viewed as too harsh on China? Is there anything? Could you imagine a situation right now in DC where you could say, let's do X, and the audience would gasp and say, oh, no, we're not gonna. And I don't think there really is much of one. I mean, it's really shocking or surprising, especially when you only come intermittently to the city, to see the change from, China is difficult to China is impossible to China is the enemy to there is no policy that's too harsh. And that's a sort of a incredible shift in a very short amount of time. And it's been challenging, of course, for everybody sitting here in Asia in particular, as most of your viewers are. It is really difficult to figure out how do you navigate in this rapidly shifting environment, no matter what your own views may be on US or China or the righteousness of this dispute or whatever. It's the speed and the scale and the complexity of the decision making that's changing so quickly. Then what do we do about that? And the last thing I would just say before I turn it back is just, this has also been challenging for others, as I'm sure, again, this might be familiar to many of your listeners, that somehow not only have we sort of collapsed all of the complications of China down to a fence and a yard, which is in every conversation, but we have also collapsed most of Asia to China. So if you try to talk about Asia policy, immediately you boomerang to China and you stay there. So you can have a conversation that starts out about any place else in the region. And I would predict that within 3 minutes, you will be boomeranged right back to China, and you will sit with the China discussion for the remainder of whatever the time is that you have. And that is also different. So I think partly it reflects the intensity of the concern about China from Washington's perspective, and potentially the reverse. But it is definitely a shift in the perceptions that you see around this region, certainly coming out of Washington. And I would agree, it's bipartisan, it's both business and government, think tanks. I mean, if I say something like, I automatically get labeled as a panda hugger, inevitably, because I say things like, hey, there's other parts of Asia that aren't China. Wow, well, then you must be a China fan. It is a very strange environment that wasn't there before.
Wow. I guess that takes us to the next big thing, which is really happening in the US, and that's the presidential election. So Rick, Evan, Deborah, what's happening in the US presidential election? It's too early to predict who will win. But what exactly are Trump and Harris talking about on the US-China question? What sort of policies might we see based on their campaigns? And how does party politics impact these policies? Rick, let's start with you.
Sure, I can riff a bit on what Evan had just brought up. I think that I think the United States, both parties agree that it's inherently dangerous to rely on manufacturing from China, particularly in strategic goods, as heavily as we have. So I think, both parties have, broad agreement on that, whether you're concerned about China because of strategic issues or supply chain restrictions that we saw during COVID, things like that. Plenty of reasons why over-reliance on any one country, and of course that one country in this context is China, is inherently dangerous.
Well,
And
so
it's a
that-
view, of course, thinking about the overall context of this program, which India also shares, by the way, which will kind of flow in for, what I'm going to comment on the rest here. Both parties, I would say right now, remain inherently anti-trade. And so the idea that the United States will come back and become, a leader again on major trade agreements, we all kind of hope, and once in a while we think we see a crack of light on that, but it never really has come to fruition. Especially with a single-term president, there going to be some vision at the end that's not going to happen. So I don't suspect that that's going to change any dramatic way. I think with either party, you're probably likely to see a further tightening of some of our trade restrictions on China, particularly in the sectors again that Nevid noted. I don't think there's a lot of divergence between the parties on being able to do that. The big question, I think, for this conversation, since of course we're talking about how all this impacts commercial ties with India, is what is that going to mean for our friends, for countries like India? Is it going to be blatantly anti-trade, striking out against every country where we got a trade imbalance or we see trade restrictions and that kind of stuff? Or are there going to be spaces for friends? And there's where I think you're going to see the biggest divergence. With the Trump administration, we actually saw a moderate intensity trade war with India. We sometimes think China was the big target, but with India, we saw the revocation of the Generalized System of Preferences program. India got hit hard by the steel and aluminum tariffs. India issued countervailing duties. It was a pretty tense time, even though, luckily the leaders still had a relatively warm relationship. But in the trenches, the trade folks were fighting pretty heavily. And I'd expect, if Trump comes back, you'll see that again. But, continued progress on U.S.-India defense will provide a pretty good floor. So it might be bad on the trade lane, but I don't think that's going to disrupt the wider relationship. I suspect that if Harris wins the election, we'll see something like status quo, meaning that even though we're not out there signing big trade deals, things like that, with India in particular, I mean, look at the joint statement last summer. On the backs of the Biden administration launching programs to domestic investment support and renewables and so many other areas, we were proactively cheerleading American companies making big investments in India in strategic sectors. There are not a lot of countries right now that either party are cheerleading outbound investments in strategic sectors. But in India, with semiconductors, with defense, things like that, and I suspect you'll have some level of status quo, which is important because ultimately, a lot of these issues like on climate and such, for India, job creation is at least as important as some of the geostrategic considerations. So if the United States can encourage some of the outbound investment, it's probably a good thing. So I'll leave my comments there, mostly on the trade economic linkages.
I can jump in. I think it's worth unpacking it a little bit from the presidential election because there are some differences that have emerged. First, on the election, we're not having a serious debate about foreign policy in this election, and we're certainly not having a serious debate about esoteric policy questions around China or Asia. So don't expect it there. There are differences between the parties, notwithstanding the bipartisan consensus that we've talked about, because the Trump administration, in my view, is kind of long on attitude and short on strategy. And when the current administration came in, these folks are systematizers, they're institutionalizers, and they're multilateralists. And so what we've seen in many areas of China policy, particularly those touching economic security, is essentially the same broad set of strategic principles that animated the last crew, but an attempt to use administrative and regulatory instruments of government, things like the Commerce Department entity list and a variety of other things, much more systematically. I said that they were multilateralists, and that's important too. You remember the zeitgeist of that when the Biden administration came in, reaching out to allies in Europe, partners talking a lot about building coalitions around functions, including on some of the trade, investment, and technology issues that animate the US debate about China. What this administration has wanted, I think, is to have a more confrontational approach to China, but to have it be multilateral as well. And the problem that they've had, as any US administration would have, is that the more confrontational you are, the less multilateral they often find they can be. And the more you want to do it in coalition with partners, the less confrontational you have to be. And the reason for that is that even though a lot of American allies in Europe and Asia share the broad set of US strategic concerns about China, it doesn't always spring from the same place or the same sources. European countries in particular don't share many of the US security equities in quite the same way in Asia. And so what that means is that we have a greater transatlantic consensus, for example, than we had before the Biden administration took office, but it's what I would call a low-hanging consensus. It's around things like screening of inbound investment, because if you rewind a decade, both at the national level and at the Brussels level, there really weren't good investment screening mechanisms in place. And then things like common sense export controls around technology. So that's changed. And if Mr. Trump is reelected, you're going to see, as Rick was implying, but also being a bit more explicit about, quite a bit of friction and scratchiness in nearly all relationships. And that's going to matter, including for broad issues with China. I mean, Rick, in passing, mentioned climate change. You know, for countries in Asia, and not least in the Pacific, for example, island countries in the Pacific, this is a big issue. And the US has tried to make this part of its offering in competing with China. There's going to be in a lot of trouble on that in a Trump administration. But there are issues for a Harris administration, too, notwithstanding all that, starting with the point Rick made about trade. You know, I mean, I agree with Rick. I used to think we had one party that had a broadly anti-trade set of constituencies in it. And I sometimes joke we have kind of two anti-trade parties now. Mr. Trump talks a lot about former President William McKinley, hearkening back to the so-called McKinley Tariff of 1890. Does that mean we're going to have a Republican economic policy of 1890? Former President Trump forgets that when the McKinley Tariff was adopted, William McKinley was not president of the United States. He was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee of the House in the House and Representatives, and actually had begun to talk a lot more about things like reciprocal trade by the time he was elected president, and he was assassinated as president immediately after giving a speech about reciprocal trade. So I think these issues are going to be in the crosshairs, but I don't think the U.S., as Rick said, is ever going to do another major multilateral trade agreement. And that matters for India at the intersection of economics and strategy, because for all the talk about the Indo-Pacific in the United States as the backbone of American strategy, the reality is in the economic space, for example, you have standards being set by three agreements, the CPTPP, the RCEP, and the Digital Economy Partnership, the DIPA. And who's on the outside of not one, not two, but all three of those agreements? The United States and also India. So if the largest economy in the Indo and the largest economy in the Pacific both decide to absent themselves or are missing in action, then you ain't got no Indo and you ain't got no Pacific, and we're back to the centrality of Asia on a lot of rule setting and standard setting. And so I do think that has some strategic salience that the American political class is going to struggle to work through with allies and partners in the first instance, but in terms of bolstering American posture and presence in Pacific Asia in particular, for the next administration, no matter who wins.
Thanks, Evan. Deborah, I do hear that you have a strong stance on Robert Lighthizer, and you mentioned that when we spoke the last time. So you have some strong views on the subject. So
yes, I do trade, right? So when you do trade policy, of course, what do you want to see? You want to see trade happening. And the reason that I want to see trade happening is not because I necessarily want large Western multinationals to win, but because I think it's the fastest way to get economic development and growth. So trade to me matters, and it certainly matters in Asia, which is why I've been here for so long, working in the region. I think what's been interesting, in addition to the shift on China, is the broader shift, which Evan especially brought out, of trade policy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, where the Trump administration came up with ideas on trade and economic policy that would have been unthinkable pre-Trump. So especially the things like use of tariffs, the tools that we were dragging tools back out of the toolkit, Section 301, which the United States swore it wasn't ever going to used again. Section 232, arguments about national security. I mean, all of these kinds of things were new and untested for years or decades. I did my dissertation on Section 301 disputes. And when I finished it, I thought, well, that's kind of pointless, right? Because we're never going to see that again. They revived the system. We're not using it anymore. And then when they started using it again, I was like, oh my God, I have to go back to my own dissertation and figure out like what were the rules around 301 and how was it used? Then we moved forward to the Biden administration, where lots of folks thought, at least on trade and economics, that we wouldn't like snap back entirely, but that we would go closer. And in fact, if you look at the policies of both Trump and Biden, Trump 1 and Biden, similar. I would say Biden was more polite about things, but basically they had very similar policies, including the use of tariffs for all kinds of things that we would not have seen before. Where I think there is a difference, it's a little unclear to me what Harris's policies will be on trade, economics, China, because she's not been in foreign policy, she's not interested. But what's particularly interesting to me is Trump 2.0. And here's where I think we have a big difference. The first Trump administration, everyone said, oh, it was bad, but we survived, right? So how bad could the second Trump administration be? I think that's a mistake. I think the second Trump administration, should it come to pass, is actually going to be quite catastrophic, because there is an agenda in place with Trump, with Lighthizer, with Navarro, with the rest of his economic team, that think they only got a portion of the original strategy implemented in Trump 1. And so you start Trump 2 with a different cast of characters, with none of what used to be called the adults in the room present, and that agenda which remains unchanged. And that agenda is make it in America, manufacture in America, jobs for American workers, and do whatever it takes to make the trade balance with the rest of the world in balance on trade and goods. That is very problematic, especially if you sit in a part of the world that trades, because what does that look like? That looks very problematic, something we haven't seen before. And I think people who expect that a Trump 2 will be blustery, scratchy, I think was the word used earlier, scratchy. I don't think scratchy gets at where we're going to be at on the trade and economic front for sure. I think it's going to be really chaotic, because they will torpedo any last attempts to try to work multilaterally or in a large group. They will be not interested in working with friends and partners despite the rhetoric. So we will have America alone, and then what do the rest of us do about that? I think we haven't really come to terms with it, but we should be prepared for a much stronger, much more challenging trade and economic environment in a Trump 2.0. Hopefully it will be better under a Harris administration in terms of a little less inward looking, but the world has changed, and I don't think we've yet figured out how the rest of us who are not in the US and not in China can figure out how to get along with this.
Wow. That sounds really ominous for the rest of the world. It's not good news at all. So looking at this scenario, how do we see companies actually? It's a question that we'll just hold on for a little later, because this actually fits in with what Evan said a little earlier. This is bleeding into business strategy and business models and how companies are reacting. So I think we'll hold this for the next session, the section. So Indrajit?
Yeah. Thanks, Vivek. We'll, I guess, pick it up with Amitendu as well in the next section. But now we thought we'd invite a good friend of Founding Fuel, David Judson, who's joining us from Texas, Austin. David, you might need to unmute. There you are. Welcome to the session. David, of course, is familiar face for Founding Fuel, the community. He used to be the editor-in-chief of Stratfor and spent about 15 years in this part of the world as well, of which I think he spent considerable time as the editor-in-chief of the largest English language paper in Turkey. So welcome, David. I know you've been kind of following the goings-on in the US around the presidential elections, and you heard Rick, Deborah, and Evan talk about it. What's on your mind?
Well, fascinating discussion. I really appreciate all the insight. Also, the reacquaintance from Deborah with a term I hadn't heard for a while of panda hugger. I think that's I guess I would have two. I mean, two things kind of fall out of this conversation for me to ask the panelists about. One is to the degree that one of the main animators of the malaise, the anger that's driving the populism in the United States, that's at the heart of our presidential election, is of course the perceived or real impact of trade since the acceleration of trade, open trade in the 1990s, and offshoring, et cetera, et cetera. So and that's driving the reshoring, the friendshoring policies, et cetera, the disruption that occurred. So I'm particularly interested in this kind of latest round when we talk about technology and some of the technologies that Evan alluded to, particularly of artificial intelligence, signaling the possibility of a further disruption in employment. And is there so are we looking at a deepening of the kind of anti-trade sentiment that's animating U.S. politics? I think that's one thing that would be interesting to talk about. The other thing is, again, comparing this to the 1990s when we were all everyone was go for open trade, and we created NAFTA and upgraded GATT to the WTO, et cetera. Back then, and the sort of structure for managing trade is still really around atoms. But the fast growing sector in global trade is digital services, cloud services, et cetera, which obviously are a different kettle of fish when it comes to regulation, because they move through the technosphere rather than across the oceans. So particularly in the case of India, where I think it's something approaching 10% of GDP is now in digital services. Does that transition in the nature of the economy affect this discussion anyway? Those are two things that.
Thanks,
questions.
David. That's useful. Evan, can I come to you for this, and then over to Vivek on section 2? Evan.
Well, I'll leave the kind of auteur adorn trade debate to Deborah. I think the trade debates and the political resonance of them are pretty well understood. What I've been struck by is how that debate has migrated also to foreign direct investment in the United States. And I used to think of investment as a net positive. People want to invest in people, plants, assets. It's a vote of confidence in your economy and in your country. But as you know, investment in a variety of ways, particularly but not limited to China, has become a political issue across the United States and in both parties in ways that were not the case before, and really belies some of the trade debates. Chinese investment, it really showcases, since we began this conversation around China, the securitization of a lot of this stuff, and especially anywhere that it touches technology. But it's not limited to China. We're having a debate about Japanese investment and acquisitions in the US too. But, for instance, J.D. Vance, who's the vice presidential nominee on the Republican side, was in Michigan the other day talking about Chinese investment in the state. There's a Chinese owner of a company called Nexteer, headquartered, I think, in Saginaw, Michigan. It's the former electric steering division of General Motors. When they acquired it, they work with the UAW local. They employ Americans. And this thing has been securitized because, as I said at the beginning, if you rewind to the beginning of the conversation, so much of the original rationale for the debates now revolves around security. I think the digital thing is interesting in that context, in part because the world is heading for fragmented rules, and also because the major democracies are not necessarily on the same page about the rules that ought to govern them. I'll leave this to Rick because India's traveled some distance with the privacy bill and other things. But if you rewind to, for example, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan tried to inject data issues into the G20 context through an initiative that he called Free Flow of Data with Trust. I recall there were two countries in the G20 that refused to sign up to it. One was Indonesia, the other was India. Now, India's traveled some distance on that, but I think that set of debates, how fragmented the rules are or are not on things like localization of data and what that means for companies, are going to matter a lot. And that's why in the early stages of this debate and of the legislative piece in India, there were so many debates among American companies about where localization in India was heading. India is not alone in that respect. I published a report at Carnegie on what we call the Korean way with data. And South Korea has a very strong impulse to localization, although it comes more from a national security rather than, as in my perception of the Indian case, a law enforcement kind of piece. But that's not where a lot of people in the United States are positioned. And so I think the digital space is going to define a lot about not just how open or closed economies are, but how multinational players are able to operate across borders. Moving data across borders, non-personal data, is going to be incredibly important. And what I think I see happening is basically fragmentation rather than integration of rule sets.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Evan. Vivek, should we kind of move to your next part? We'll come back to you, Deborah and Amitendu as well, because there will be some more questions, I'm sure, on open trade.
Yeah. We'll also come back to the question that Evan raised about digitization of data in India. We'll come back to Rick a little later in the India section. Let's Deborah and Amitendu, you particularly based in the Indo-Pacific. And that's one big theater where the US and China are squaring off. But data shows that FDI from China is almost twice that of the US in this region for the last, 4 or 5 years. Both of them are the top trade partners with the region, especially if you look at ASEAN. But going forward, what's going to happen? Is the US likely to be as effective a trade competitor to China in the long term? Or are we likely to see a more aggressive US approach to trade and investment in this particular region, in the Indo-China region? Doesn't matter whether you define it from a US lens or an India lens. Amitendu?
Yeah, do you want to take this one first, Amitendu?
Okay, no worries, Debbie. Thank you so much, Indrajit. Sorry, and Vivek as well. See, let me come into this, Vivek, from the point of view of the fact that, look, we have been having this very fascinating discussion around the US-China rivalry, competition, the ways these have been shaping positions along with the evolution of the geopolitics. But the idea of Indo-Pacific, in a very strong sense, I think, needs to be appreciated first for the fact that the idea of Indo-Pacific is very relative. There has been this Chinese position that China has been a part of Indo-Pacific, and Indo-Pacific is not antithetical to the Chinese understanding of the region, but the Chinese reservation is with the United States articulation of the Indo-Pacific. So how that pans out and which way that pans out is something that will remain entirely relative, and that will probably impact the way we look at the flow of foreign direct investment across the regions. The point to note, Vivek, is that, look, foreign direct investment is beginning to get dispersed the way the trend is shaping between countries, because foreign direct investment just cannot be completely exclusive of the geopolitical relationships, because there are issues that arise. And in a large number of cases, it's also a matter of impression. So let's say, for example, when one looks at Chinese investment into India, there's probably this view that Chinese investment into India is not welcome, which I'm quite sure is certainly not welcome in at least most important sectors. But the point to be noted is that India never blocked Chinese investments. By way of policy, even when the India-China hostilities were at their peak in June 2020, and whatever was announced before that and right after that, India never put out any policy completely blocking Chinese investment. What it did was to actually put the Chinese investment into a category of access which was not automatic and which required sanction from the government, approval from the government. And that was as much as it was applicable to countries with whom India had land borders. So I would argue in that sense that, this whole idea of whether the United States will be investing more in the Indo-Pacific, whether China will be investing more in the Indo-Pacific, or there might be a coalition in the way the capital is moving in the region, will eventually depend on the fact that there's a lot more that we will see beyond statistics. Statistics actually might not be the right descriptor of the way the foreign direct investments are flowing in. So, for example, when we look at greenfield FDI that has come from China over the last 5 to 10 years, there is research evidence that shows that one of the countries in Indo-Pacific which has received a huge amount of that Chinese green FDI is Vietnam. Similarly, at the same time, there's also a huge amount of Chinese greenfield FDI that has gone to Mexico. Now, whether one considers Mexico to be the backyard of the United States or an extension of the Indo-Pacific is a very different point of interpretation at all. But I think it will be a little, perhaps narrow in vision to think that Chinese FDI will necessarily flow in a one-to-one direction with assumptions that are entirely geopacific. It might not happen that way. At the same time, United States FDI might also actually start shaping in a way which is not, again, totally one-to-one causality based. So I think what we are probably going to see is a situation where there is going to be a lot of fluidity in the way capital moves around. But there's no doubt that much like trade is showing broadly a tendency of concentrating among a big group of countries which are quote unquote like-minded and strategically comfortable with each other, there might actually be some sort of a similar tendency arising for FDI as well. But then that is also what is indicated by statistics. Beneath that statistic, let's say, for example, if you look at Chinese FDI moving into Vietnam, it doesn't really fit into the political understanding of the China-Vietnam relationship, and there might be confusions in accepting it. So there's going to be the counterfactual along with the factual, which will be existing side by side. And that, in a sense, will be something which will be playing out very actively in the Indo-Pacific.
That's fascinating, because I will ask you a question on how India and Vietnam compare in competitive terms a little later when we come to the India section. Deborah, what's your view?
I was going to say, I think, first of all, it's important to remember that firms trade. Countries don't trade, firms trade. So we're talking about firms trading in, for example, manufacturing, where it's true that Chinese-based companies have had a dominance over most of the rest of the region now. They're the number one importer and exporter for every country in this region, displacing the United States in most cases for manufactured goods. In agricultural trade, we have a slightly different pattern, but still, actually, surprisingly, I think Chinese agricultural exports are also quite important. And so we have to remember that firms are trading. They trade in agricultural goods. They trade in manufacturing goods. There's also a lot of services trade, which is much more diffuse than trade in goods. And there are lots of different kinds of firms that have done very well. And in particular, I would say America-based firms have been very successful in services trade in and around the globe, but also in and around Asia. And finally, there's investment. And I think one of the things that I've been threatening to do for a long time, eventually I will actually do it, is write a paper on who is us. So we talk a lot about sort of Chinese investment, American investment, Indian, and whatever, in somebody's investment. Who are we talking about? And even if you look at the most sort of vanilla type firm, if you peel back the layers a little, you discover often that it's not just, the firm that appears to be, say, Singaporean, but Singaporean firm, but it has investment, or it has control, or it has directors, or it has establishments that could be in China, they could be in India, they could be in the US, they could be everywhere. They might have Canadian pension fund money invested in them. I mean, so who is us when we talk about this? I think that's becoming more urgent than ever to think about as we reflect on what geopolitics does to business. Clearly, business is paying more attention to geopolitics than they used to, which I think is probably good. But it's also, I think, just a necessary corrective to remember that whatever politicians say about what should or shouldn't be happening, firms are the ones who are making that decision. And sometimes firms line up with what politicians want them to do. And oftentimes firms don't. And they don't for a variety of reasons. Maybe they had no idea. Maybe they didn't see eye to eye with whatever the government rules or regulations or ambitions were. It could be that the incentives are completely wrong. It's just too expensive. Yeah, you'd love us. Of course, I'd love to be not here, but unfortunately, like, where else am I going to go? Difficult. And so I think some sense of reality on the ground is always important, but it's more important now than ever, because we just have to recall that these are companies and they make decisions every day. And many of those decisions are at odds with governments. The last point I'll make before I stop talking for a second is, how can government influence that? Well, one thing that we've seen a lot more than we used to, I think, is sudden, sharp government policy changes, regulatory changes. Regulatory sanctions would be a great example, export controls, measures of all kinds that can be implemented very quickly. And crucially for companies, they can upend a business model. So you were doing perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden, there's a regulatory change that is sudden, sharp, and dramatic, and now you're no longer profitable. So I think that's where when we talk about the world fragmenting, how is it fragmenting? Well, one way that it's fragmenting that matters to firms is if the regulations start to be sudden, abrupt, changeable, and most crucially, not aligned with others. And that's what we're seeing.
That's really interesting, because that also comes into, as we'll see in the third section, that also comes into a lot of India questions on the India-China issue. We'll come to that later. But just before we go there, there's, Amitendu referred to geopolitics in the region, and there's the whole question of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. US holding military exercises makes the headlines every day, as of course China's moves. So, Evan and Rick, how do you see these moves, particularly across the region, particularly if you look at economies like Vietnam or Indonesia? How are they receiving this? How are they perceiving this? Is this in any way impacting their attitudes on investment from China, or it's all about the economy at the end of the day? Rick, shall we start with you?
Start with Evan, because I was going to take it a little bit different direction. So Evan, I think, is way smarter about the direct question here.
All right.
Well, there's a lot of diversity in Asia. So when you talk about the South China Sea, most ASEAN countries are not claimants. And in fact, there's some diversity among the claimants in terms of how they're proceeding. And there's been some difficulty in, as you know, getting ASEAN consensus. So I think those are going to play out the way they're going to play out. At a macro level, these things matter because a lot of what we've been discussing, really, frankly, we've seen lots of strategic competition between big powers in history. A lot of this would just play out in the economic realm if the United States and China didn't have a trigger for war. And unfortunately, they do. My attention goes much more to the Taiwan question than to the South China Sea question, which I think will tend to stay, notwithstanding what's happened in the Philippines lately, much more low level. And there, the assumptions and presumptions that basically have governed the status quo on all three sides of that triangle, Beijing, Taipei, Washington, are shifting in ways that are potentially quite destabilizing. For China, the balance of power is shifting in China's favor. Military power, financial power, economic power relative to 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Part of that is by default. Part of that is by design. But because the balance of power and of the tools that are in the coercive kit bag is shifting, it creates temptations to use it. In Taiwan, a combination of generational change, politics, local identity, the way China dealt with Hong Kong in the last several years has really solidified a drift away from the mainland. And in the United States, to be blunt about it, you have a lot of people who want to relitigate elements of the framework of US policy. They think, to put it simply, China got a good deal, Taiwan got a bad deal, and they'd like to relitigate the terms of that, not least by injecting ever greater levels of officiality into the US-Taiwan interaction. So that's heading for a place that's potentially destabilized. And one piece of that engages military deterrence. Another piece of that engages the political side of this. But for firms, a war in the Taiwan Strait would be absolutely catastrophic. It would have catastrophic effects on the US economy. There wouldn't be much left standing in the Indo-Pacific on the other side of it. And so firms couldn't escape that. What I usually tend to call people's attention to are the scenarios that are short of war, because the reality is that China has spent 20 to 25 years assembling a coercive kit bag that has a lot of tools in it from which they can mix and match. Cyber attacks, turning off the lights in Taipei, collapsing the new Taiwan dollar, directly or indirectly coercing firms, and all of that provides a pretty robust kit bag that they can lean on, quite short of war. And a lot of that stuff matters for firms too, but matters in a granular and scenario specific way.
Yeah, I was
Rick,
gonna
yeah.
pick up
So
a couple
we
of
look
other
at the broader
threads.
question, the Middle East
Yep.
and Russia.
Yeah, we've had, for obvious reasons, I mean, a lot of conversation about what's happening in the Indo-Pacific and what that means for India's commercial and trade interest. But both between looking at data on global crises that have impacted India's commercial ties, as well as we've been doing some work for the U.S.-India CEO Forum on supply chains. We've been interviewing about 50 major American and Indian supply chain leads and talking about some of the geopolitical issues. And I think we got to also bring in the fact that there's two other crises in the world that are having more of a direct impact when you look at India's evolving trade flows. The first is instability in the Middle East, particularly in Yemen, where attacks on carriers and suddenly, seeing that there might be potential shutdowns in the main lane of traffic to be able to move through the Red Sea is causing a lot of companies now to think about supply. Because if that gets shut off, you think about the longer routes you have to take to be able to move goods, between that route to be able to get to major markets in Europe and the United States. So as this, both in Yemen as well as the other issues we know well in the Middle East carry out and get extracted, companies have to begin thinking too. If you want to be able to move goods quickly for supply chain integration to get stuff to customers and such, it becomes a lot more dangerous to keep the old trade lines open. So you haven't seen dramatic shifts yet in trade numbers and foreign investment, but if this keeps up for longer term, which looks like in May, I think that's going to have a bigger impact maybe over the next 2 or 3 years than even China will, even the concerns that we've got about China. And then for India's sake, the single biggest determinant factor on changing trading patterns with major partners has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Global sanctions provide an opportunity for India to buy low-cost energy, fertilizers, even textiles. And suddenly, Russia, which had been a relatively nominal trading partner, right? India's 25th largest trading partner pre-war, is now number 4. And, again, this conflict, no end in sight. It may continue for quite some time. If sanctions continue even after the conflict, India is able to take advantage. And this is a 15-to-1 trade deficit in Russia's favor. And thinking about where we've seen policymaking in Delhi, the fact that they have a 6-to-1 deficit with China has triggered a lot of anti-China trade measures, or sometimes globally applied. Okay, for a short-term basis, cheap oil from Russia, can you sustain a 15-to-1 deficit if it brings energy prices down? Sure. Over 5 years, over 10 years, if ultimately the trade relationship stays high and it's a massive imbalance, then will there be additional pressures there? So fully understand the reason the conversation has been very China oriented, but I just wanted to, Vivek, take a moment to inject those two other issues that today I think are, in the case of Russia, and may very soon have an even bigger impact on India's short term, which is between Russia and the what's happening in the Middle East. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Those are great points, actually, because that's a lot to think about, the Russia and the Middle East question. Indrajit?
Yes, thanks, Vivek. Thanks, Rick and Evan. We will come back on the Taiwan question a little later, maybe. And but we do need to kind of wrap up this section on China. And I'd like to invite Professor G. Venkatraman, who is based in Indore with the Indian Institute of Management there. He's a sinologist, lived and worked in China as well, and a Fulbright fellow, a recent Fulbright fellow, if I may add. Venkat had some points to raise in the conversation around what's cooking inside China, because that has major implications.
Yeah, thanks, Indrajit. Thanks, Founding Fuel, for this session. Very stimulating session indeed. My question is addressed to Dr. Evan. Just yesterday, UBS UBS economists have said that the GDP growth in China is going to decline, this year, 4.5%. Subsequent year, it is going to have a further decline of, somewhere around 4%. Now, domestic prices and export prices both are falling thanks to overcapacity blues. So if you look at domestic prices across sectors, the construction machinery, lithium batteries, the steel sector, you can see overall fall in the price. Bloomberg has reported very recently that many of the Chinese economists are pretty pessimistic about any possibilities of revival in the domestic demand. Despite all this, Xi's China continues to flex its geopolitical muscle. Now, given this, my questions, two questions basically. What kind of impact one can see these developments will have on China's internal political dynamics, number one? Number two, what kind of impact it will have for companies, corporations in terms of China-related firm-level strategies, business strategies, especially in the supply chain sector. Yes, Dr. Evan.
Do you want me to? Okay, I can take it. I'll try and keep it efficient because, as Rick said, the conversation is China-centric. It's important not to. First of all, China's facing a lot of economic headwinds, property crisis, challenges in the export sector, a lot of challenges in the labor market, especially for white-collar graduates and young people coming out of universities. Having said that, I just kind of make two macro points. First, the debates about where the growth is going to come from are really not new. If you rewind even to, let's say, as far back as 2007, the then premier of China, a guy named Wen Jiabao, famously gave a press conference in which he called the Chinese economy unstable, uncoordinated, unbalanced, and unsustainable. And China's had a growth model that was kind of long on production, short on consumption, but in a continental-sized economy that in some ways is growing kind of like the United States did at the turn of the last century. So trying to transition the growth model from kind of investment and exports to something else has been at the core of political economy debates in China for a long time. The second macro point I would make is that Xi Jinping's answer to that set of questions is quite a bit different from set of his predecessors. And it's important not to look at him or at the policy challenges that are being filtered through the prism of the senior echelon in China now, through the prism of, say, the 2000s, when China could grow its way out of pretty much anything. They can't grow their way out of anything anymore, much less the 1990s, when the then premier of China, Zhu Rongji, who is a fairly liberal by Chinese standards person, was trying to take China into the WTO and made a lot of structural changes, including, you will remember, laying off 40 million people out of state-owned industrial enterprises in Northeast China to discipline the economy and get it ready for the competitive dynamics of the opening. Xi Jinping is different because he's never been about growth for growth's sake. And the reason for that, if you want to find method in the madness, is that the secret sauce in China for a long time was about pumping up material gain and economic benefits as a solution to the political challenges that bedeviled the country. And that was fine until you had 450, 500 million people that joined the middle class and grew rich. Increasingly, Chinese, but especially urban Chinese, have expectations and demands that transcend things that are merely material. They want food that they can eat. They want air that they can breathe. They want water that they can drink. They want equality of life chances for their children. They want a system that's basically not corrupt, not just a high level, what Xi Jinping called fighting tigers, but also the low level, swatting flies in their everyday life. And so that being the case, the threats politically to the party's rule, but also the priority for his regime has really been around what I would call welfare gains. quality of life indicators. And at one point, they even eliminated growth targets as a KPI for promotion for local cadres at the local level. Shanghai, for instance, got rid of the growth target a few years ago, then restored it. If you think about it in that context, a lot of what's happening is not just about fighting economic headwinds. It's about finding a growth model that will deliver quality of life and social returns to an ever greater number of Chinese, particularly urban Chinese. And for this leadership, the answer increasingly seems to lie with a faith in technology, what they call new quality productive forces. But it doesn't necessarily mean, as we were talking before, fighting the United States at the frontier. A lot of what this is applying technology to old industry in a way that basically allows China to reap productivity and efficiency gains. And if they can do that, inject greater productivity and reap greater efficiency gains through the application of technology to old industries like, for example, shipbuilding, what they're betting is that they can both get an employment boost and also begin to have a more technology-centric growth model that will be good for them in the long term. But in the short term, there are a lot of headwinds, and those are things that are facing firm calculations too. China's still investable, but it depends a lot. You have to get granular about that. It depends a lot on the sector you're in. It depends a lot on whose capital you have in your fund or in your firm. And frankly, it depends a lot on how connected you are to China's own strategic objectives of moving its economy up the value chain. If you're prepared to transfer a lot of technology and knowledge to China, China is highly investable in a lot of sectors. If you're not, then you're looking for to diversify your model, whether it's in the supply chain sector, as you said, but particularly in technology and knowledge-intensive industries.
Terrific.
It's probably more China than you ever, probably enough conversation.
All right, thanks for that. We'll just come down to the India section, and we're running a little over time that we planned for each of these sections. So I'll just request our panelists to keep the answers a little more concise, if you don't mind. I'm sorry I'm saying that. Let's start with Deborah. Deborah, you talked a great deal about how firms would look at this and how firms would actually analyze their own strategies, in the face of all this geopolitics that's going on. So how do you think India is looking at it, and how do you think India can go ahead and capitalize on this opportunity?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities for firms in India to do lots of things, quite clearly. But as some of the comments in the chat noted, there are some challenges as well. And most crucially, the big challenge that has been in place, as this audience, I'm sure, knows better than anyone, has been around manufacturing. So large-scale manufacturing is never easy. And trying to get the manufacturing sector to work in India at scale for the size of Indian population has been a challenge and remains a challenge. And so while it's heartening to see more enthusiasm for inbound investment in particular, and for eliminating bottlenecks like transport, logistics, and all of the infrastructure that one needs in order to be successful in manufacturing, that still is uneven. And so I think that's important. And I would say, and again, I'm going to make this very brief, another area where I think India could and has been, but could do even more, is in the digital space, in thinking about the technologies and the future, and what kinds of digital policies, digital regulation, digital solutions, skills, etc. The whole infrastructure around digital is going to be key to the future. And so pulling that into India in a comprehensive way that, most importantly, aligns with others, larger is always better, I think is important.
Amitendra, I mean, you spoke about, the issue between China and India, and you alluded to a lot of the political issues there. But then you see what's happening in at the ground level, so to speak, and firms are upping their ante on China. Whether it's EVs, there's joint ventures happening, fashion label Shein is being brought back by Reliance. You know, there's even investments in electronics from Lakshya recently. There's lots of high volume purchases that I hear about, renewables, solar modules, battery technology, all that. The trade numbers are just going up. So how is India going to manage this sort of business push vis-a-vis its own foreign policy constraints and security constraints that it might have in that arena?
Vivek, I think just to take a cue from what Debbie mentioned in her last intervention and also the one before that, you see, firms obviously look at prospects in the matrix of their own calculations and in the medium and the long term. Indian firms, unfortunately, are in a rather confused state. And that confusion arises from the fact that there is a certain external macro level geopolitics which would want India to engage with the rest of the world in a particular way. But that is not necessarily consistent with the requirements of Indian firms. And I think that tension is beginning to become pretty visible. So, for example, if you look at the way the numbers have panned out, and there is this clear talk about the China Plus One strategy, the fact that India will be an important part of the China Plus One strategy. Yes, but I think when Indian firms look at the China Plus One strategy, their idea of that strategy is not entirely geopolitical. They do think that in their effort to become a part of the China Plus One space, they actually need to engage with China in a specific way. And I think that learning is very important to take, because the examples that you mentioned, for example, in the area of electric vehicles, in the area of solar panels, in the area of even lithium-ion batteries and so on and so forth. Over the last 4 to 5 years, in spite of the incentives that have been awarded to Indian firms to expand capacities locally, we don't see much really has happened, honestly, except for some limited areas like smartphone production. And even in those areas, there are now challenges with respect to establishment of vendors at Tier 2 and Tier 3 levels. So as a result of which, Indian firms are not really yet, and when I say Indian firms, I'm using this term in a very heterogeneous way. I'm not, sort of making it exclusive at this categories and sizes, but maybe more towards the MSMEs. They are not really thinking of integrating into global value chains as a first priority. They're thinking of survival. And when they're thinking of survival, they're thinking of the domestic market first. And we're thinking of the domestic market first. They look at China in a very different way. They look at China as an important source of their inputs because they're the most efficient ones that are available to them. They're not available internally. And that's true for much of the rest of the world as well. So that challenge remains. But here the question that comes up is that if this is the way things go on, then nothing changes on the surface. China remains India's biggest trade partner, notwithstanding what is going on otherwise. So the geopolitical objective of de-risking from China, forget about decoupling, doesn't really materialize. And that lever, to a very large extent, given the balance of power, remains with China. So the threats and anxieties about economic coercion perhaps remain valid. But then the question is that how do you reverse this? So that is probably where, Vivek, the point that you raised, the question of whether India should look carefully at the prospect of inviting Chinese investment into India in certain sectors is beginning to gain certain traction, because that's actually happening elsewhere in the world. So you find Hungary joining forces with the European Union in imposing countervailing duties on Chinese EV imports, but at the same time being very eagerly happy and willing to bring Chinese investors into its own territory for making EVs. So I think these are realities which are very different from country to country, economy to economy. And for a country like India at this point in time, there is really, insofar as a generic firm-specific idea is concerned, there is a tension between the way they are expected to align from a broad foreign policy perspective and between the way they would actually want to align from an economic rationality perspective. And that tension is not going to go away very easily, because across the world, the challenges are going to become far more complex. There are more conflicts. There are more tortuous relationships that are going to emerge, which are going to impact the supply chains, which are going to affect the creation of standards and rulemaking. So in that process, we must not forget that Indian firms by character never look outside. Most of them actually look inward. I mean, that's been the legacy. That's been the way they have been trained and formatted. And the firms in India who look outside don't have a political constituency to back them. So as a result of which, the offensive interests of Indian firms in free trade agreements have remained very limited. So as a result of that, you see Indian FTA negotiations continuing to be characterized by defensive postures. And that, unfortunately, will remain the story, because that is where there is a clear tension between the way one side of the foreign policy idea is going to get imbibed and the other side, where there is a real urge to survive in the current circumstances.
Those are some great points, Samitin. One has often written about how MSMEs are particularly vulnerable, and that's I think very key. Let's come to Rick, who knows India probably better than I do. Definitely has traveled a lot more. So, Rick, if one looks at this from an in US, India, China perspective, one looks at the FDI coming in from China, how would the US look at it long term? And then if one, the second question would be, if one looks at, say, a competitive stack within India, within the states, and some of the tensions that come in between national policy and state policy, because you've particularly dealt with some of these questions on the ground. So how do you look at both these issues?
Yeah, sitting in a lot of boardrooms of American companies lately, I'll tell you, it's at a knife's edge right now. You look at the long term, you look at the economic growth, the fastest growing large economy in the world, expected to be the third largest economy by the end of the decade, possibly the second by the end of my life, doubling China's population by the end of the century. Like, you look at those numbers, and it is absolutely the place you've got to be as a company. And then you look at the business environment, which still remains devilishly hard. And, the question is, do you jump in now when there's a lot of headwinds and it still is tough? Or do you wait until it's a little bit easier, in which case you might lose a lot of market share? So I think a lot of companies are really, right on a knife's edge. I mean, we all think that India's starting to win a lot of these investments because you got some really shiny announcements by Apple suppliers in particular. But guess what? FDI is down dramatically. It was 70 billion in new equity in the middle of COVID, and it's down to 50 billion, starting to rebound a little bit. Despite all the pressure against China that we've all been talking about this entire time, China's still pulling in 3 or 4 times more FDI annually than India. So there's still a lot that has to happen. And Vivek, you asked the question exactly right. We've also talked a lot about trade deals and what is Modi going to do? A lot of this stuff, like if you're sitting in a business planning meeting, where does political risk end up? Where do trade deals end up? Last page or the annex, right? It's more about what are the factors of doing business today? Can you make stuff at a competitive cost and sell it at the right price? And a lot of these answers, really are whether India is going to be able to win major in global supply chains. It lies in places like Bhubaneswar, Lucknow, and Hyderabad, more so than it does in Delhi. They talk a lot about double engine growth, that, states that are politically aligned, but it's just not true. If you look at some of the Modi government's biggest initiatives on like the Jal Jeevan water mission or wind power or solar power, states that are in opposition oftentimes actually do better in these areas than states that are aligned. So even that double engine growth that people kind of take for granted, if you look at the government's own numbers, shows that it's not always true. So, you got a lot of things that Delhi does control, which are helpful, customs duties and things like that, some highly regulated industries. But the real factors of production, electricity, water, effluent treatment, labor regulations, land, these are all things that are almost exclusively controlled by state governments. And, to answer your question very directly, I mean, that is my day job, is engaging all 28 states on a range of projects simultaneously. And today, I really think there's probably just a handful, maybe 3 or 4, that wake up every day and think, what can I do to get in front of major investors? 5 or 6 years ago, like every state had their investor summits, chief ministers were traveling the world. That's actually down pretty dramatically. You don't see as much aggressive approach, but Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, I would say UP. There's a lot of the national government support to UP to try to get in line. Hyderabad's been a champion across multiple governments. So there's a few places that I think are shining stars, but a lot of parts of India still have not been able to achieve momentum. And I think that's where a lot of work has to happen. I'll just wrap up by one point by, when the Modi government came out, it was trying to initiate stronger manufacturing, the Make in India program. Part of that was competitive cooperative federalism, starting to rank state governments on their business environment and such. It was never perfect, right? States self-reported, there was always some questions. Why do some states rank so high? Very different than businesses actual. But it was the first time they're actually trying to put their arms around states and provide them tools to do better. And the political pressures, even in a single party majority, has kind of forced a lot of this competitive cooperative federalism to fall off. You don't see the rankings anymore. The business rankings are gone. And that's where I think being in a coalition makes it harder, because for somebody who spends a lot of time in Patna, and I want the best for Bihar, they're going to rank low on a lot of rankings. And that means a coalition partner is not going to look good. So I think, states are really kind of having to stand alone and do their own thing. There's a few that are trying, and a lot of them where it's just not on voters' agenda yet. But I think the key to that massive success in attracting supply chain investments, it does lie in state capitals. And I think all of us doing our best to try to get states the tools they need to do better and compete. It's on all of our interests. I'll wrap it up with that.
Rick, I'll just ask you a supplementary question to that,
Yeah.
because you talked about cooperative federalism. India's a noisy democracy. We've got a coalition in place. We are a democracy, but then if you look at that entire picture and then compare it to some of the other places like, say, Vietnam, if there is a competitive stack that we have to draw up, how does India figure, and where does it figure in that sort of a competitive stack? Does it figure at all?
It does. I mean, look, $50-60 billion in FDI, it's well below China, but it's way ahead of where India was, 15, 20 years ago. And the trade relationship, India is one of our 10 largest trade partners. The United States is, swapping with China as India's largest trade partner. And, when India thinks about too, like on the other end of things, again, we've been talking a lot on manufacturing, but I think it was Debbie before that talked briefly about services. India is what China is in global manufacturing, India is on global services. There is a huge crown on the jewel, right, that we sometimes kind of ignore. And part of it is we want to increase employment, and that kind of appeals to the high-end, high-skilled folks and all that. But, India has had massive raging success in an area that in many ways, is more high-tech and high-end than what China has been able to achieve, in the high-end services side of things. So it's not like India is without monster victories in critical areas of the global economy too. But replicating that in manufacturing has been a lot trickier. And that's partially because the policy environment that has to be there for manufacturing, it does involve a lot more state-related policies than it does, in services, which is mostly driven by national issues on data privacy and things like that. So it's been pretty good. But, my own conversation with companies, is that countries like Vietnam and others that got their act together a little faster, that can take decisions a little bit quicker, their scale is so much smaller than India, that I think some of these other markets that were first to the punch, companies are already reporting that it's a little harder to find land and harder to find labor if they want to make those big investments. So I think there's a second bite at the apple that's coming up faster than we imagine, from that first wave of investment that was looking at other than China. And, again, hopefully this next 5 years, a good run. And, you mentioned coalition. I mean, Modi's other coalition partner, Chandrababu Naidu, is probably the single best commercial diplomat that the country's ever had at any level. And so, sometimes coalitions work in favor. So we'll see how that kind of plays out. But thanks for the question. Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time. We
Yes.
officially got just 10 minutes to go, but
Yeah.
can I just request our panelists to stay on to say another 10 minutes beyond the scheduled time? I know there's a lot of audience questions coming up, so I hope you guys do stay on.
I will have to hop off. I've got a board meeting that I'm doing that I got to speak at. So if there's any on my angle, if you can throw them a little on the early side.
Sure.
All right. Okay.
Thanks.
Indrajit?
Yeah. Thanks, Vivek. We'll do a quick rapid fire audience kind of round now because we're conscious of the time. I try and kind of invite Dinesh Narayanan, who's a senior journalist, author, columnist. He has a question for the panel. Dinesh, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, fascinating discussion. Thanks for organizing this for Founding Fuel. And my question stems from 2 points, which one Evan sort of put out right in the beginning, and then what Rick mentioned about the other conflicts going on in the world. Do you think India will be increasingly forced to choose a side? I mean, we've seen statements from the US ambassador to India, Eric Gassity, that in times of conflict, there is nothing called strategic autonomy. And we also had the Swiss ambassador saying the other day that neutrality is not necessarily, if India wants to play a larger role, then neutrality probably is not going to, if you want to influence, then you have to take on more responsibility, so to say, in international affairs. And considering that foreign minister has been very clear that the relationship with the US is the centerpiece of the strategic side of the relationship is a centerpiece. What do you think? Do you think India will sooner or later will have to choose a side? And in addition, would investments also ride on this? And most of the FTAs which India is negotiating today, practically everyone is asking for investment protection as well.
Thanks, Dinesh. We'll quickly go to Ivan and Rick. Do you want to kind of come in quickly with short, maybe responses? Would that work? Ivan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll leave the investment
Okay.
question.
Sure.
I remember Jaishankar being on stage with, I think it was David Petraeus some years ago, and Petraeus said something like, well, sooner or later, India is going to have to choose a side. And Jai looked at him and said something like, well, we've chosen a side. We've chosen our own side. And I think that probably is where Indian foreign policy is heading. I don't see that, and I think American administrations will be largely forgiving it. For most countries, the mathematical operations that matter are addition and multiplication. They're not subtraction and division. And so for all that the US wants to sharpen the contradictions, I don't think India is going to be the only government that's going to resist that. I'll leave the investment question to Rick.
Thanks, Evan.
Well, and I'll split out even the part on choosing a side. India has chosen a side on its single biggest strategic concern, right? I mean, the Quad, the US-India military cooperation, the kind of things that we're doing in the field, most of which is unreported. Like on China, we are absolutely, like, there's a question about, is South China Sea or Indian Ocean the main area of, where there's a difference and such. But that China is the main threat, and that is driving cooperation, no question. On every other issue in the world, then absolutely. Like we may be on opposite sides, we may be, but on the single biggest strategic threat, I think we both realize the partnership is too important to break up. On the investment side, I would say that now that the United States, I think, is finally starting to wake up to the fact that you can't totally separate security and commercial issues. For us, when we think about why is the United States helping India expand its defense manufacturing base, we would rather sell stuff, of course. It's because we realize the choice really is like, will India continue buying a ton from Russia or build its own industrial base and maybe buy a little bit from the United States? Building India's industrial base is better than buying from Russia. And if that's our best option to try to pull that relationship away, it's good. And I think we're starting to see the same thing in areas like semiconductors and other strategic areas. So I do think the linkages are pretty good right now. But getting back to what might happen in the US election, I think encouraging outbound investment in these strategic areas, if Trump comes back, I think gets downplayed quite a bit more. But right now we're in a pretty good spot that way, where I think the linkages and the ability to encourage American companies to go to India, it's unique and it's kind of powerful right now in some of these areas. So I think the linkages are there for the moment.
Thanks, Rick, Evan, Dinesh as well. We'll jump to the next one, if that's okay. I'd like to invite Rajrishi Singhal, a very senior, again, journalist and columnist and author as well. Rishi, if you're there, would love to have you ask your question.
Thanks, IG. In this mix of very fascinating geopolitics and geoeconomic discussions so far, when viewed from the Indian prism, we seem to be encountering some kind of schizophrenia at two levels. One is, as Rick mentioned, India's impetus to work together with the West, particularly the USA, in the Quad. And this is despite the widening differences in trade that we have seen in successive WTO ministerials and the blame shifting that goes on in climate talks. The number two is, I saw the discussion leapfrogging to cross-border data flows and digital trade, but we haven't actually sorted out the outdated aggregate measurement of support for agricultural trade, which, by the way, is still based on a food index from the late 1980s. So how do you think this structural dualism, if I may call it so, will play out, whether it's a Trump administration or a Harris administration?
Who would want to take a stab at it? Deborah, would you like to go?
Sure. I mean, I would just say, schizophrenia and is common. It's common and it's going to stay, because you have contradictory impulses. You have different decisions that get made in different settings. You are at a time of disruption in general, right? Many of the old ways of doing things are clearly being revised. We don't know what we're headed towards. And so I would expect schizophrenic policy to continue in a lot of different ways, so that you will be aligned closely with some players in some settings and less in others. And then it could shift altogether within another 2 years or whatever it happens to be. So I think, you need to just be prepared to have different discussions with different members in different places. And it's up to India. I think maybe it feels from India's perspective like you're the only one who's in this situation, but I would just say everybody says, don't make us choose. Don't make us choose what? Don't make us choose who over what, when, in which time zones. I think that's a very common reaction to have. But I would say that in times of disruption, it is always very helpful to remember that having those align with you is better than having those who dislike you. So trying to think about how do we build out our own coalitions that suit our interests, that get what we're looking for, and then cooperate with others, always useful.
Thank you for that, Rishi. Then Deborah, I like Amitendo to kind of jump in as well with a short comment and perspective on this same question. Would that, Amitendo, are you there? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Rishi, thanks for raising that. And I think the point that I would like to make in this regard specifically is that, look, when it comes to a country like the United States and the way India, in a trade perspective, would be looking at the outcome of the United States election right now, is perhaps not as much in the area of bilateral trade, but more in the sense of what the new US president and his team actually means for the rest of the world and how those developments might impact India. I think that's of a somewhat bigger concern, because I think over the last 4 to 5 years, and even during the Trump administration and subsequently, there's a certain amount of equilibrium which has been arrived at between the United States and India so far as their trade relations are concerned. I mean, they have agreed to disagree on certain issues, but on certain other matters, they have agreed to work together. And that is evident in the results that are coming up. Perhaps a lot of these is happening outside the radar of the media or common conversation. But the more important thing is that how does, let's say, within a community of the G20 group of countries or within the G7, certain issues that are strategically sensitive, that are geopolitically having wider implications and also spilling into other territories of economic engagement that India has with other countries. For example, the way it might impact India's relations with certain countries in Southeast Asia, or in its neighborhood of South Asia, or maybe in the Middle East. How would those be impacted as a result of the United States elections? I think that's something where there's a certain degree of uncertainty insofar as the Indian policy-making space right now is concerned.
Thank you, Amitendo. That's a very useful perspective. I'm just kind of conscious of the time, Vivek. So if it's okay, I'll try and kind of move towards closure. And first, thank each of our panelists, Rick, Evan, Deborah, and Amitendo, for the time that they've spent and the perspectives that they've shared. Fantastic. I mean, we couldn't have asked for a better session. I know we could have gone on for another hour easily, but it's that kind of a topic. So we've had to be conscious.
There's so
Yes,
many
that's right.
questions that I could have asked.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And thank you, Vivek, as well for steering it and also putting together those burning the midnight oil to put together those briefings. They were mighty useful. Thank you for that.
Was a pleasure. That was a pleasure.
Thanks so much. And before I close, there are a few things that we tend to do, which is that we don't kind of end this conversation with the masterclass. We try and bring some closure and reflection. And we've invited 4 members of our audience who are with us this evening to record short 2-minute audiograms, which will come back to us through email. In terms of, then the question we've asked them is, what's new and different that emerged from this conversation for you? So they're going to record that hopefully today or tomorrow, and we're going to put those in and produce those short audiograms. We'd also have a very nice handcrafted summary of the insights that my colleague Shweta essentially anchors. Rick, thanks so much, and we'll certainly let you go. Please carry on. There's not an issue. Thank you. And that'll all come to you along with the recordings, of course. And we're hoping that we've shared LinkedIn profiles, and that this is not just a opportunity to network, to learn, but also to network and get to meet so many interesting people who've joined, including our panelists. So thank you very much. Really a pleasure to have all of you, and a big thank you to the panel. Thanks so much. We'll call it an end here. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.